I want to start with the scenario because I think it's a nice segue. The scenario that I have for us to talk about at the end is one where very, very relevant. So it's one where we find out that during Bad Bunny's Super Bowl vignettes, there part of it was included a included part of an oral history from an elder from D-Lock. It's an elder from Cantera talking about her experience during Hurricane Maria during the power outages. She signed a CC by NC license years ago, and it's a non-commercial use, at least a arguable non-commercial use to use it. But the family hates this association. So we're going to be thinking through where ethics come in. Now, my personal introduction to archival ethics began at Duke in the 90s, around 1995. The Behind the Veil project was included graduate students, not myself, but graduate students like Paul Ortiz, who would go on to pioneer in oral history. And they were taking the stories of Jim Crow South. They would go into communities with a tape recorder and talk to the elderly who had lived under the same kind of traumatic experiences that we just heard about. They consented in good faith, and the student interviewers dutifully obtained the proper legal releases. Some of them were even the very new idea of a Creative Commons release, which I know that you dive deeply into elsewhere. But in other words, a release where it's the individual granting rights to the world. Ethics comes in to me because these interviewers were speaking to people who had an idea of where they would go. They'd be going into this vault, these literal physical rooms where the transcripts and the tapes would be put, and a researcher might come in years later and read about their experience. They couldn't conceive of a grandchild or an employer one day finding these stories with a search engine using a electronic device that all of us use every day. The Jamaican American scholar Ifeoma Nwankwo coined the term Black cosmopolitanism to refer to the decisions that were made by Afro-descendant people in the newly independent Caribbean nations and the people who moved from those nations to England, the United States, Cuba, within and without the Caribbean. The decisions that they made. And I think it's a good metaphor for what we're talking about here. There's decisions that have to be made about how we will provide preservation and access for oral histories. When we had the Jim Crow South, I was able to argue that not only did these people think these things were going into a vault, but they had they had given over deliberately some very specific, traumatic, possibly criminal issues like being a Black lesbian in the South. So my work, and we resolve these. I think these things have been resolved on the individual level at that institution, and DLOC does a great job. What I really appreciate here, though, is the opportunity to take these conversations and have them more broadly and transparently so that we're speaking in general and speaking out loud about how we resolve these issues as we go forward. And that's where my work lives, in that gap between that dutifully obtained release and the reality of our new digital age. And to me, hearing you all speak, D-Lock, and I'm going to say arepa, but I know that's not right. Um, that I see you having a conversation. You are inviting the other partners and the individuals who are doing the interviews not to be extractive, but to start that conversation. And it's like working on Wikipedia, that there's these areas where norms are being created in real time in reaction to what we're dealing with. And really looking forward, I'm at the end, we will just point to AI because things are happening so quickly that if we have these, what I call inflection points, if we have audits on our side, that's exactly what I think you're doing right now by continually going back to your partners. So I can't wait to, for us to all talk more about that. But let me just go back very quickly to what I call the legal tug of war between fair use, domicile, and expectations, and why ethics comes in there. I think in general, I like to think of law as the ceiling, as the floor. And ethics is what goes on top of that. Law is what you have to do to comply, but then there's the ethical things. And we have all this power as the people behind the scenes to continually bring in ethics. And I think it's a really important example when someone comes into the institution that has the power to change that dynamic and say, well, you promised these people the opportunity to revoke consent or to have an embargo, but I'm going to change that. Institutional neutrality, archival neutrality was a norm for such a long time, and it's something that at this point we're still having to justify bringing ethics in. And what I hope to see in 5 years is a transformation where consciously include the ethical considerations first and continually. So I think I'm so delighted to be speaking to get today behind two projects that are doing exactly that, your models. But let me just talk really quickly. So fair use. That means in the United States, we have Section 107 of the Copyright Act, which can make it legal to use a work, but it could still pose a massive ethical problem if there are sensitive narratives from the Caribbean. Um, for example, what we were talking about with the hurricane and other disasters, we also have to navigate, and this is a second way of thinking about it, is that these are sovereign nations and people who are going to other sovereign nations. There were different rules. So there are some examples, and I found this in DLOC, that a Jamaican work could be hosted on DLOC, but in the public domain here and under copyright in Jamaica. What do we do? We know that we have some ethical choices, and then DLOC requires end users to sign off on rights agreements, on rights acknowledgments. That at the very least get people started thinking about these things. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the way that location matters. So if someone is domiciled in Puerto Rico, their moral rights could be triggered under Ley 55/2012. That's not just a theory, there's some actual rights. But I am not a scholar of the law of Puerto Rico, but knowing that the person who is interviewed in Puerto Rico might have that understanding that shapes what they think they're doing, that they might feel that they might have, whether quote correctly or incorrectly, they might have the understanding that there's some privacy rights that exist after their death, that the interview that they're providing is connected to them in a way that we just don't think of in the United States. So we have the choice to say, we're here to preserve and provide access. Or we can say, what are they thinking? And that's what I like seeing directly integrated into that permission because you're not that's not just permission. This is why I say all the time in all the different contexts where I get to help create these permission documents. It's not just a document and it's not just a one-time permission. That is the conversation. That is explaining what rights we are thinking about. Uh, I know I'm running a little bit long, so I just wanted to point to, um, in the in a United States situation, right at the beginning of oral histories, being used, Creative Commons licenses being used in oral histories, there was a situation where a Milwaukee oral historian was a white person was interviewing in the Black community. And one of the people in the community was the principal, whose words had been taken out of context so many times that she basically became her own lawyer. She not only negotiated, she didn't just go with the Creative Commons license that was given on on the slip. She negotiated one that was asked for more. It was CC BY and C and D for those who know, which means that her interview was audible but not downloadable. She restricted the derivatives, she restricted the downloads, and she's essentially creating a moral right for herself. So she's using the law as a shield, the same way that the family of the person whose oral history is used might ask to take it down, the way they might use it as a sword. But it's very important in in our conversation to remember that the repository was the one that could turn on and turn off those rights that the person who gave the oral history had requested. And so I think that is the ultimate ethical intersection. What do we do? How do we use our technology and our ongoing conversations with the community to continually enable the ethical access to this information. And then finally, I have to at least point to artificial intelligence. So there's no uniform AI guidelines in the world or the Caribbean. So should we allow these stories to be scraped? Do the open access we provide put anyone, anything, any narratives in danger? So what I think is great about DLOC is that I see a constant understanding of the need to evaluate legal risk and mitigate legal risk, but also to take into account the ethical consideration, for example, of whose risk are we thinking about? I deliberately chose this background. It had people in it. I think the more typical way to is to think in terms of, oh, beautiful blue sea, tranquil waters, and there's nobody there. And that's the extractive model to me. But as I said, anyone who's actually lived in the Caribbean or anywhere near it knows that it's people. There's always people there. And that's who I think you are keeping in the picture here. So just to conclude and recap, three things I think are super important are the audit rights and the fact that you're constantly auditing, keeping those deeds of gift or those records, keeping the rights transfers or just keeping track of the rights, I think is so important. And I'd like to see us have, again, like how can we use technology? How can we constantly improve how we help you do that? The legal nuances of, weighing things like fair use, which lets us do more. Section 108 of the Copyright Act, which lets us do more, versus understanding and incorporating the moral rights and the other kinds of understandings that the actual interviewees and their communities might have had, um, and how we use our technology to do that. So I'm so glad that Perry at UF and all of the other folks on the partners and folks on this call have the ability to think through this and start working through this. And I look forward to conversations.